Peace and love, everyone. My name is Andrew Hewson. I'm a spiritual teacher. I'm here with my friend Davidya Buckland. David is an author. He has a book, Our Natural Potential. He also has a blog, Davidya.ca, where he writes about explorations of life and enlightenment. David and I have been having conversations, recorded conversations, for about a year now, and we're back together this month to discuss non-duality. So I'm going to let David go ahead and start in our exploration of this uh, subject.
Well, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, it's a big subject,
Yeah.
and it's been spoken to for thousands of years. In the Vedic tradition, uh, the foundation of non-duality comes out of Vedanta,
Mm.
the darshana or philosophy of essentially oneness, of wholeness, of totality. A number of ways of talking about it. The Brahma Sutra is perhaps the best known text associated with Vedanta. Um, the framing of Advaita, and which means not one, or rather not two, um, and or oneness and non-duality, the way it's framed in a general kind of way these days was from an emphasis by Adi Shankara some hundreds of years ago, and he founded four seats of learning in the four directions in India, and each one of those seats of learning, Shankaracharyas, is based on one of the primary Vedas, the four Vedas, and one of the four Mahavakyas, or great sayings. I am that, thou art that, well, this is that, and so forth. But the key to understand here about non-duality is that it's about oneness of all. It's totally inclusive. This is not about feeling interconnected or some value of experiencing oneness with with a lover or with an object of perception. This is on the level of being, where we actually are living. We're living oneness, and we can certainly have tastes of this at various points and different flavors and experiences prior. But what oneness is pointing to, what non-duality is about, is that oneness in being. Now, generally speaking, the process unfolds through the stages in consciousness. Initially, there's the recognition of the self by itself, known as self-realization or cosmic consciousness, has various names, where that inner consciousness, the capital S self, recognizes itself. And this kind of creates an inner oneness, but it's still a duality because there's an inner oneness, but the world out here is still separate and distinct. In time, in that stage, there's a refinement and purification process. And at some point, there's a recognition that the world is also the self. It's kind of like there's a world appearance playing out on the screen around us, leading to all of our experiences, and the screen itself on which this is playing out and from which those experiences are arising is consciousness, and that consciousness is the same self. It is myself. And when that is recognized in the level of our very being, there's a shift, and the sense of being a subjective observer and the object side are merged together into one wholeness of consciousness interplaying with itself. And then with time in that, at a certain point, and there's various ways this may unfold, but generally speaking, as we go deeper and deeper into that oneness, and more layers are included, which is essentially the topic of the Brahma Sutra, all the various recognitions of that is myself and that is myself, and so forth, in various, because it's the intellect in this process that's become associated with consciousness and is recognizing itself. Um, and it goes through this process of recognizing until it reaches a point where it knows itself in its wholeness, in its completeness, and at every point within itself, to the degree that we can um, process that through a human physiology. But there's a recognition of that functionality of wholeness, and then it's kind of like consciousness has been looking in on itself the whole time, and it realizes that, realizes this, and he turns and looks beyond itself. And then there's a recognition of um, that which is beyond consciousness, and it turns out the consciousness itself uh, isn't the isn't the completeness we thought it was, and there's a transcendence into what is typically called Brahman in this context. Um, and this is when even the subtle dualities of conscious and not conscious, existence and not existence, very subtle dualities are resolved, and Brahman is inclusive of all, this total inclusiveness. And that is essentially what non-duality is about, this totality of inclusiveness. But this is, very difficult to describe. Uh, Most people are experiencing through the senses and through the mind, and having separate bodies, and they're distinct from other things. And so just a general oneness in consciousness is a revelation, but a totality of oneness is beyond most conceptions, and it's beyond words, because words are inherently concepts and in the mind, or meaning in the mind, and so on. And so we can't really put our heads around it, but because we are it, we can live it. Anyways, that was kind of a extended extended introduction, but that's kind of the broad context. If you really want to understand non-duality, it's there's a you have to recognize the completeness of it, and what those old texts like the Brahma Sutra and what Shankara was speaking to was so much more than a simple, experience of passing experience of inner oneness in consciousness.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for that introduction. There's a couple things that reflected back here as you were speaking. The first thing is as we speak about oneness, there are some that uh, consider themselves expressing non-duality that perhaps would take issue with the term oneness. You know, on the basis that non-duality is a negation, so it doesn't place any affirmative value on anything. Now, um, this is a certain perspective that's present in the spiritual marketplace right now.
Yes.
And of course, oneness as a word has been abused, I would say, to a certain degree. So I understand perhaps partially where it's coming from, because a word can get out there and just sort of be used within the realm of general propaganda, or sales, marketing, and things like that, and lose any sort of potency or power that it once had. But the negation of duality is not the end of the story. You see, the recognition that there's no duality doesn't necessarily point to what there is. So there is what I would consider to be a partial um, recognition that is oftentimes in place, that would see a term like oneness, or any sort of acknowledgement of affirmative recognition or realization, as potentially sort of being something that is inaccurate, or just more mind stuff, or something like that. So I am basically getting around to the point that it's important that we recognize what the term oneness is really pointing at, and you sort of brought it back around to that. It's not merely a concept, it's not merely a word, but it points to a direct recognition or realization that there is only one reality. Now, what that one reality is recognized to be shifts, because initially that one reality can be recognized as the self, the one self, this one field of conscious awareness. And it's conscious awareness that recognizes itself as the all pervasive field of conscious awareness. So it's not something that anyone realizes as an individual entity in that sense.
Yes.
It is the non-entityhood of conscious awareness that realizes itself as being the essence or the substance that is appearing as all of creation. So that's one level of oneness, we could say. And there's even qualitative variations within the context of that recognition that there is only subjectivity. And you sort of pointed to the possibility of there being the sense of the observing or the witnessing being what is recognized as real, the pure awareness seeing itself, yet that not being um, something that translates into the recognition of form. And so there still seems to be a duality there. There's still the sense that there's reality, and then there's the unreal world, and that could even have different qualitative interpretations in terms of it's unreal in the sense that it's a dream, or it's unreal in the sense that everything that we thought it was isn't what it is. You know, we made all this stuff up, and we created all these names for these objects, and it's all, you know, all just conceptualization of this story of separate individuality. So I'm kind of just laying out the very broad spectrum of possible perspectives, and one of the weird things is that, and maybe not so weird, but I guess these days I think it's kind of strange, is that there all of these various perspectives or degrees of realization are kind of simultaneously playing out in YouTube land or in the spiritual marketplace. And oftentimes they're just considered to be kind of the same thing. Like there's there, you know, just maybe people are saying the same thing in different ways or something like that.
Yes, actually, that's one of the fundamental issues with modern interpretations of what Shankara had to say, or Vedanta itself, is this assumption. There's in some circles there's a denial of stages of enlightenment.
Yes.
That there's this perception that there's only one enlightenment, and anything beyond that is just a is a, you know, a flawed understanding, a delusion, you know, various ways. There are also traditions like the Papaji lineage who recognize stages but don't talk about them in defined ways, and avoid speaking to them because it can generate concepts that can be a barrier to living them. And this is true. I mean, if we get concepts that we, you know, we hold concepts ahead of the reality. We're you know, making the map into the road, and the map is simply a representation. Concepts are just a representation. However, you know, you don't deny the map to the person on the road either, and it's important to recognize that if you're going to be talking about Vedanta, it's something that unfolds in stages. It's not something that happens all at once. I mean, I've certainly seen people move into that place rather quickly, but I think 6 months is the fastest I've seen someone wake up and then go through the process into Brahman. Usually it takes some years, and there's an unfolding process. And it's ironic that the concept that there is no more stages is another concept that's a barrier. So just in the same way that someone thinks, oh, there's all these stages and they're supposed to happen this way, and I'm supposed to experience these things, that can be a problem. But on the flip side, thinking there is no such thing, or that such things are a delusion, are equally a barrier to the same process. The whole thing is we have to allow this thing to unfold with some value of innocence and surrender, and letting it be as it is, because we're moving into territory we've never been in. And it's certainly an upgrade and an improvement, but the mind can never grasp what it hasn't known yet.
Yes.
I mean, I could, if you've never tasted a dragon fruit, I could describe various, aspects by comparing it to other things. The way, say, they describe how wines taste, that it has a nutty or a fruity flavor or whatever. Um, you can kind of point to things that way, but until you've actually experienced it, it's just an idea.
Yeah.
So it's very important here that we put it in the right context, so that we're not assuming that Vedanta is all pointing to the simple realization of the self, and that we can write off the world because it's an illusion. I mean, that's just one perspective of the world,
Yes.
of a number of them.
Yes. Yeah. Beautiful point. And so when the term oneness is used here in this context, in these conversations, it's pointing to the direct, unwavering, obvious recognition that the entire environment is made out of the one self that sees itself as the appearance of the world, that sees itself as the appearance of creation. And there is no sense of separation in that. There's not a sense of a separate person that is experiencing that and saying, oh, hey, I'm so and so experiencing that. That doesn't mean that there isn't a personality and that there's, life doesn't continue to unfold, but it's unfolding as that oneness flowing within itself. And that's a particular stage, you and I would both say, and we have language for that, a concept which points to the subjective realization that is being spoken of. So the
Yes.
concepts themselves are a non-issue if we recognize them as concepts and we hold them uh, in a certain sense with care and attention. If there are disclaimers that are made, um, I feel that that's really sometimes the most supportive way of uh, allowing them to sort of be revealed in their essence, but at the same time not using language or not uh, uh, pointing to what is a directly realizable recognition of reality is not supportive and yeah, can leave this sort of empty blank space of incommunicable whateverness, where nobody knows, like, oh, it's just all, yeah, like that. So
Which the mind is
uh,
very uncomfortable with.
it,
Yep.
it is uncomfortable with this, and so there is an intelligence in that sort of uh, over what I would consider to be oftentimes an overemphasis on non-conceptualization, or sort of a heavy emphasis on non-conceptualization, but it really pertains to sort of the transcendence of egoic dominance, because the sense of self associated with the human ego is so, as you said, frightened by that. There's a sense that there's control in concepts, or that through intellectual acquisition or understanding that it is adding to its possibility of something, or sort of gaining power over something, or whatever the case may be. I
Yeah,
think
it's safer too. Yeah.
safer. Yeah, there's a false sense of control. So then one of the ways in which that was sort of counteracted was through sort of the removal of the validity of concepts, that it's just whatever, it's not, that's not it, whatever you say isn't it, kind of thing. And that has its place, but when that goes on indefinitely, then perhaps it's
And you've got a
not.
concept of no concepts,
That's
basically.
exactly it. That's the point. So it gets around to a new conceptual baggage that is the negation-based concepts. The know this, that's not it, and then it becomes a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will, which really leaves a little room for flexible fluidity within the realm of dynamic experience.
Yeah.
And it can develop into a rigidity, which you know, may not be the most supportive of the fullness of life, we could say. So if you have something to say there,
Yeah,
David.
I also wanted to mention too that some people have the idea that somehow you have to understand this in order to live it, and you have to have it figured out. And some people are not, don't have strong intellects the way we do, as an example. And
Yes.
so there isn't the same inclination there, but there can be the fear that if I don't understand this, that I'll never be able to live it. But in actual fact, such a person has less baggage to unload. And you don't have to understand this in order to live it, because once it is lived, then the understanding comes. Because the deeper you go, the more inherent the intelligence is in whatever we're experiencing, and the more alive and clear that is, the more apparent it is to us. So at a certain point, they talk about sometimes as the inner guru, the essentially experiences come with their own understanding at a certain point. And as we get confident with that and clearer and so forth, then there isn't the same need for outside sources or whatever as well. And so it just takes care of itself. So yeah, but it's just getting out of the entanglement of the mind, which is the biggest challenge on the spiritual path, and for many people, is that strong mind that's it has its advantages, but the mind is a very powerful tool, but it makes a poor master, and that's kind of the role it usually ends up in for many identified egos when we don't know who we are at a deeper level. The mind kind of steps in and tries to take over as the new master, but tends to create its dramas and struggles and all kinds of issues. So yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. It makes a poor master but a great servant, right?
Yes.
That's the key. So in that sense, I find that it's natural to sort of move towards some degree of reflective confirmation within the realm of human dynamism, whether it's through a teacher or through some level of scriptural reference, or whatever the case may be. And as you were pointing to, not everyone is going to have the same tendency to move to express that in particular details or anything at this it, and I would say that a part of the cases where it is expressed in a more sort of particularized or detailed way is that it then sort of provides a certain set of possible confirming mirrors within the realm of that which is ultimately the non-conceptual direct experiential recognition of what is being pointed to. So there are those that appreciate your blog and what you're putting forward, and they understand what you're writing about through their own experience. They may not be expressing it verbally in the same way, or interested in putting it into details in the same way, but they appreciate that's taking place there.
Yeah.
So it sort
Which
of
has
is supportive.
which has been a surprise.
Yeah.
It wasn't something I was expecting. Have some facility with words, but it's just kind of what started, and
Yeah.
that kind of started flowing out. Well, the writing process started happening a couple of months before I woke up, actually. it was kind of a precursor in a certain way. And then I started the blog a few months after that. Yeah, it was very curious. This is the last thing I expected here.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
It's
it's one of those things, there's these concepts we develop about, I studied this stuff for years before I woke up, and had all these concepts about what it was supposed to look like and so on. And I already recognized that some of them were a little faulty because, for example, that I witnessed for many years before I woke up, and that was supposed to be part of, according to the concepts, were supposed to be part of waking up. And it was, some of the refined perception stuff that can unfold for people, that unfolded here long before I shifted as well. Um, and but there was still lots of concepts, and so there was this, for me, there was this throwing out my conceptual baggage with the shift to allow it to be as it was, and then gradually the mind brought it back again in the new context and with much better understanding. And you don't recognize you're doing that, but you're hearing a speaker and adding these concepts from wherever you are at the time. And we add this kind of these ideas, which can give us some framework and some general understanding. There's still value in that study and pointing at reality, but um, we have to carry it lightly, so to speak, which isn't always easy to do for a strong mind, but um, and recognize that that's how we understand something today is not how we're going to understand it in the future at some point. It's going to evolve, and so not to be too fixed or rigid about it. And
yeah.
you get a little too much of that thing, and you get into discussion groups and stuff where people are talking about non-duality, and there tends to be a lot of, like, this is the way, this is the only way, and I'm right and you're wrong, and I have the better teacher. This teacher has this experience in this lineage, and this teacher has this experience in that lineage,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a little too much of that going on.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great segue into something else that I wanted to go over, but I also just want to kind of go back to the expression in language and conceptualization piece just for a minute, because that's something that I value to a certain degree in terms of our ability to communicate,
Yes.
higher values of reality, and to do so clearly and without feeling limited, and or a stickiness around them. And I feel that for humanity, as the collective uh, level of conscious experiencing continues to evolve, that will become increasingly relevant. At the same time, we're going to be passing through this sort of emptying out stage where our mistaken value of concepts is being sort of undone. And that's what a lot of the sort of more modern interpretations of quote unquote non-duality tend to emphasize, in the sense that everything is sort of negated as being just a story or just a thought or just a belief or just a narrative. And that's true, within a given context, but there's also no context given when they're saying that. Just as a little side note there, the it's referential to that which is based in the illusion of separation. But if we uh, are directly tasting the separationlessness of reality, then our ability to speak and express isn't somehow completely undone and forever removed, because this whole human experience is largely stratified in different levels of seeming separation, in the sense that things are something that they may not actually be on a more essential plane, or from a more essential recognition. So the the capacity to speak, um, and to express and to hear is something that has the potential to uh, be in alignment with truth. It has the potential to be in alignment with clarity. And yeah, there's going to be a period for all of us on what seems to be a more individuated level where we are passing through the purification of where that has been out of alignment or where that hasn't worked or where it has been mistaken. And then, through that, witnessing a new found freedom being born forth. And then that also takes place on a collective level. So accuracy is possible, particularly when the language is aligned with a direct uh, experiential energetic resonance as it is being spoken. So I can
And
give an
and there's
example.
a key thing in there just to touch on that's so important. The vast majority of people have that initial shift of waking up from being a me or a person into recognizing that they're actually this cosmic self, or there's a number of ways that might be experienced, but that shift into self-realization and recognizing um, they're not this individual local person. For most people, that's catalyzed. Um, there's no reference point in their experience for awakening, and so for them the trigger is usually um, uh, maybe not at the time, but sometimes at the time and sometimes a little after. But the trigger is usually a teacher or someone who's awake, speaking from the self to the self in the person. So speaking these pointers
Yes.
um, and to the understanding. And for some, what that does is the mind relaxes and it is willing to let go because it feels like it's appropriate and safe and like we talked about before.
Mhm.
And for others, it's just like it's like the little click goes, and then there's this shift, and the self sees itself, and the recognition happens, and then there's quite often a release of some kind, crying,
Mhm.
laughing, both, and that aha moment all kind of mixed together. Um, and it just takes a moment, but there's often a pointing and a catalyst that's in there, and it kind of comes together at that point. So there's a value in having the framework to support the unfolding, so that we're supporting what we're experiencing, and so that when some strong experience comes up, or some new unfolding comes up, or whatever, we have a bit of context for what's unfolding. We don't get in the way of it, and we're able to support it. But also that on that deeper value, that potential for a shift to take place.
Mm. Yeah, beautiful points. Beautiful points. I was just going to give a little example of the alignment of language with direct energetic resonance,
Yes.
and uh, and then I'll say something else about that. So a term like pure awareness can be said like pure awareness, or it can be said pure, silent, changeless awareness, full, vibrant, conscious presence. That qualityless, no thingness, which is prior to this full, vibrant, conscious awareness. Pure, radiant, supreme divinity. So those are uh, different possibilities for language being aligned with different recognitions of reality.
Yes. And if you come to that purely with the mind, because that's we're so habitually somebody is speaking, so we have the mind there listening to interpret the words.
Hmm.
And if we hear it only on the level of the mind. And it's like, why is he talking funny? But if we've cultured enough presence, or transcendence, however you want to frame that, to be there, then there's that potential for that to hear,
Hmm.
and a whole different thing can unfold.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful. The the other point that kind of ties back into to just walking through that together is that there are different aspects to infinity, and you and I have spoken about this many times in reference to the masculine aspect and the feminine aspect,
Yes, I wanted to bring
and
that up.
uh, and then there's that which is uh, prior or beyond both the masculine and the feminine aspects
Yes,
of the self,
again,
and
uniting into oneness. Yes,
yes, into one. So, and then there's what I would consider to be the only reality, which is pure divinity,
yes,
and pure divinity is actually what appears as uh, nothingness or qualitylessness, pure awareness, and conscious presence, or the feminine. So uh, that just gives some context for the non-duality, because in each of these different sort of prevailing conditions, there is a recognition of separationlessness, we might say. And as you pointed to, there can be some variations in that, in the sense that there could still seem to be certain things that are not included, and that the totality of inclusiveness sort of really reaching its fullness in the recognition that what we are is actually the source of conscious awareness, the source of the infinite field of divine light. Mm.
yes,
So, in the expression of what is currently considered non-duality, sometimes it's coming from what I would consider to be a pretty basic initial shift that's characterized by the negation of the sense of a separate self. And so therefore, any kind of talk about an infinite self or even conscious awareness uh, is oftentimes negated, as there is no awareness, there is no consciousness. Those are just, you know, there's just no person. There's just no uh, um, separate knower or separate individual. And I would say that even someone that's been sort of indoctrinated in listening to that over and over maybe would hear us speaking right now and uh, presume that there's just, separate people here talking about all this maybe fanciful stuff about what they think non-duality is, but we're really deluded, and we
yes.
don't know what we're
I've
talking
certainly
about.
gotten that. Yes,
Yeah. Which is totally fine. It's totally
yes,
fine. But in case anyone maybe was interested in another possibility, I would just say that I experientially seemed to pass through a stage very early on where I tasted that sort of what I would consider to be the rendering of the conceptual level of ego identification, sort of vacant or unreal. And in that, what basically shows up is kind of the sense that there's still form, there's still, what may be even considered to be an objective world, but there is no individual knower, there's no individual self knowing that, or experiencing that, and there's no doer, so things are just happening, and whatever appears just is. There's no reason for it, there's no meaning for it, there's no value to it, because there's no separate individual that really would value it or um, see any meaning or significance. And if there was that, then that's just an illusion or a projection of a separate individual that isn't actually there. Okay, so we get the kind of basic picture, but and I believe that I tasted that condition for a reason, in the sense that it was so that it could be potentially useful to those that may be mistaking that to somehow be some sort of final realization or something ultimate, um, at a later point, which is what we're here now speaking about. Useful in the sense that I'm able to speak from having passed through that, mm, and through grace not have gotten stuck in that particular space, where it does seem as if basically it's all about the whole story of awakening or spirituality or whatever, kind of is rendered like just a big story, just a big narrative, because there's no one to awaken, there's no one to anything, there's no one to pass through stages, there's no one. And one of the wild things is that even, and this takes place, I mean, there are teachers that are expressing this, that even like the thousands of years of spiritual traditions and lineages are kind of dismissed as being just nonsense stories, like all of the great scriptures are kind of written off as being somehow just referential to some entity that isn't there or something like that. And it can it's really wild, because it can be such a sticky situation, particularly if you're teaching that or sort of regularly speaking that, and people are biting at the hook that's being put out there. Uh, so if
Yeah,
if you
I
have
just
anything
want
to
to
say.
say that I myself also had a sense of ego death. Not
Mm,
everybody does, but some people experience the sense of ego expanding to become cosmic,
yeah.
or there's a devotional surrender or something like that. But here there was a sense of ego death. But what became clear in a bit of time was it wasn't actually the ego as a function that died. It was the identification with
Mm,
with the ego as who I was.
yeah.
So the ego as a function was still there, kind of like my thumb is still there.
Yes.
There's still a function, and it's still needed so that I know where my foot is relative to the floor and the stairs, and I can walk up the stairs without falling down. and there's still you still need a sense of person in that kind of context, and so to be able to talk to someone in a semi-normal kind of way and function in the world. It's just that it's no longer the center. It just
Yes.
the center falls back into the universal consciousness and then deepens progressively further. But yeah, but it's useful to mention too. You touched on the masculine feminine part,
Mm-hmm.
because the stages that I outlined earlier were the masculine process in consciousness, and those can be experienced in a very flat and dry kind of way, like you've been pointing to at some of the occasions. But when you bring out um, that feminine side, the aliveness, the liveliness, the tendency to express um,
Mm-hmm.
within consciousness, there's this whole other side of the process that opens up. And it really depends on the practice, and that's one of the reasons I recommend the practices I do. Is they help not only with that touching into consciousness, but they help refine the process in the interim. And also I recommend healing um, emotionally and energetically, because we tend to carry a lot of baggage that's also reinforced in our culture. So usually we have to do a little bit more targeted healing approach to clear out our energetic baggage, which acts like a veil, covers up the layers between that inner consciousness and our surface experience. And it shifts everything from being this kind of dry, flat emptiness into a fullness.
Mm-hmm.
And space is alive. It's not just an emptiness. It's an alive fullness. And there's also this quality that each of us has our own unique blend of laws of nature that are
Mm-hmm.
functioning. through this body mind. And so it's kind of bringing out a different experience of wholeness, of the totality, and it's adding that to the whole. It's like our unique contribution to the whole is through just experiencing our life and our unfoldment, and that brings out this other way of experiencing, and it's all part of the one whole, and so it adds to that one wholeness. So there's real value on the other side of that, and there's the whole unfolding of the feminine side we've talked about in other conversations.
Hmm.
That's an important part of the process to fill it out. And actually, modern Advaita conversations usually leave out the later part of Shankara's teachings. His early teachings were much more pure intellect and kind of dry um, and so on. Very, I mean, he was a profound debater and so forth. But in the latter part of his life, he had an unfolding uh, of the feminine side and recognized the Divine Mother and wrote beautiful poetry and so on like that. So it's kind of like this: the ideal unfoldment is both the mind, the intellect, and the heart. That or the masculine and the feminine, to bring them both along. We each have our own mixtures and emphasis, and we go with what's here. Um, but it's nice to be able to round out and balance that a little bit, if we recognize that possibility is there.
Yeah, yeah, that's a beautiful point. There's there's another kind of what I would consider to be a misperception surrounding the idea of the direct path, and so non-duality is associated with being this direct path, like the pathless path, the stepless step, all this kind of negation, flip around language. I use it myself. I'm not putting it down. It has its place, but it oftentimes presumes that any sort of application or practice, as you were just pointing to, is somehow useless or limiting or yeah, a trap or something like that.
Yeah,
Because it just supports the sense that there's someone doing something or someone moving in a certain direction or whatever the case may be. And that kind of ties back into what I was saying about the uselessness of traditions and all of those different things, potentially different strange perceptions like that. So the one of the things I'll clarify, although I did sort of taste that what appeared to be kind of semi-objective, empty of conceptual identification space, the initial shift here was very much a feminine shift. So it was more of a devotional sort of unfolding or flowering, if you will. And then I was able to taste the masculine variations in the context of that, and sort of it was a back and forth, you might say, in
yeah,
terms of more presence and more absence based recognitions of reality.
yeah,
So, and the masculine tends to be on the absence based side. So, any kind of absence based teaching typically is characteristic of a masculine shift. Now, even in that context, I would say that a lot of times there isn't what I would consider to be a true recognition of the masculine aspect. It's a negation of the mental or conceptual level, and the story stops there. Period. That's it. And
yeah,
so there are teachers teaching from that space. It doesn't mean that they see that they're infinite. All they see is that there isn't a finite entity. That's that's it. And so
kind of boring to me.
it is very boring. It's very boring and dry. But at the same time, one of the things I think it revolves around, David, is the selling of the end of suffering. And so that's kind of worth touching on. Is suffering in general, throughout the ages, has been utilized as a sort of motivating factor,
Yes,
perhaps in a certain context, to move towards the possibility of not suffering. There's different motivations as well, such as love and commitment and those things. um, but one thing that I've noticed in the current non-duality marketplace is that there tends to be some sort of a transactional appeal taking place within the possibility of the one that seems to be suffering being gone or removed, the me that seems to be suffering being seen as an illusion. And so when these certain teachings are pointing to the fact that there's no one there, there's no one suffering, that's not going on, that's an illusion or whatever, it can provide some false sense of temporary relief, almost like some pressures being let off. So it's like if you're listening to these repetitive hammerings of negation, it can allow for there to be a sense that somehow things are better, uh, better in the sense that there just seems to be uh, the clinging to, or the glimpse of something being cut through that was being assumed, the clinging to the whatever is being expressed within the realm of negation. But there's no real lasting peace being found. There's no real lasting bliss being found. Uh, there's no true unfoldment of potential, yeah, of what the human lifetime really holds as a possibility. And so in that sense, I would say that they uh, tend to perhaps be not necessarily in alignment with truth. They can be within the field of sort of peddling um, this a false idea of relief, or whatever the case may be, a false sense of relief. And that's not always going on, but I have a sense that it is to a certain degree.
Yeah, there's certainly the idea of spiritual bypassing that has become well known more recently, where people are using spiritual practices or spiritual concepts or approach to avoid their issues, to avoid their life, to run off to the ashram rather than deal with your need to choose a career um, or to deal with relationships or to um, you know to, buy into that negation framing,
Mm-hmm.
because then you can just dismiss all your experiences as irrelevant.
Yes.
um, and there's a certain value in taking them less seriously and not buying into the drama in the same way. But as you mentioned, when you take them too far and then use them as a negation of your dharma,
Mm-hmm.
of why you're here, um, then you're basically just getting in the way of, you're actually creating suffering,
Yes.
essentially. Maybe not directly, but at some point it has to be faced.
Yeah, well, it all comes back around to balance. I mean, there's a place for negation,
Yeah,
and negation is very powerful, and it's going to be very supportive in our unfoldment and in certain stages. But if it's not complemented by that which doesn't just leave it at negation, but also folds back in and attentively allows the residue of what has been seen through, or what has been rendered ineffective through seeing that it's not what it seemed to be, then it's going to just end up with that flat, dry, you know, um, empty sort of uh,
flavor.
flavor of and I'm working with folks that are coming from a space of whateverness, what's the pointness, meaninglessness, uh, and because they've heard in our talks even sometimes about the feminine, something is stirred in them, and but they're coming from this space of like, I don't know, I'm just in this place where there's just whateverness, meaninglessness, pointlessness. And oftentimes that's characteristic of just a lack of balance in the
Yeah,
context of both the feminine and the masculine. So when we speak about practices and application, these I also prescribe certain methodologies that I feel to be supportive, and they involve healing and allowing and transmuting and
yeah.
observing and those kinds of things. So
There can be also a place where, as you're approaching a shift, the first shift, where the old drivers of the ego that were motivating your life
Yes.
are falling away, and so
Yes.
there can sometimes be a flat period in the approach. I mean, we shouldn't expect that. It really varies widely, but it is one of the symptoms sometimes that happens. It happened here, where what used to drive the bus has gotten off the bus, so to speak, and but the actual identification hasn't yet broken, and so there's kind of like this draining of motivation and you know, desire to get things done or whatever, and you know, what do I do with my life, kind of a thing.
Mm.
And there can be that, but that should be a temporary phase as long as there's appropriate spiritual practices, and you don't kind of buy into that as a new well, this is the truth way, kind of the true way of being. Because at
Yeah.
some point, and especially if there's some feminine being cultured, at some point, the deeper movement of consciousness itself and the laws of nature and so forth move to the fore and start moving into life. Because once we get out of the way, then it can move through our life. But if we're kind of partly out of the way, but not quite, then it's kind of not quite moving through yet. But so there can be a kind of transitional period there. But then life just happens through us, and it's a
Mm.
whole different. It's a very different experience of life. Same life in many ways, but just a lot smoother and a lot better, a lot more feeling of support, because it's just like what's moving through is supported and you know, uh, finds expression.
Yes. Yeah. Beautiful point. There, of course, it is going to take place where the things that were pulling us forward or pushing us, seeming to push us forward, being sort of seen through or emptied out, are leaving us in a space of just feeling as if they're we 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 don't know what to do or what the point of doing the things that we once valued would be anymore.
Yeah.
And there are even different degrees of that. You know, we can go through like a supreme whateverness that sort of is present in reference to you know, the qualityless nothingness being dominant and different stages, and that's very appropriate. The emptying out aspect has its value. That level of intelligence has its place, has its
Yes.
value, because we're moving from being motivated by our own control mechanisms and belief systems and programs that were referential to this false sense of separation into being motivated by the commitment to truth and love and the flow of bliss and those kinds of things. And there's lots of different lots of different seasons that we go through. There's different cycles, you might say, and
Yes.
stages, and all of those are to be acknowledged. But it's when one is singled out and sort of taken to be the only possibility that it potentially becomes an issue.
Yeah.
Um, so it being emptied out is beautiful, but being filled up is also beautiful. So we're being emptied out to be filled up. Yeah.
There's
And
something more.
yes, with something.
Yeah, and nothing is ever lost in this process. It's like the fuller value of it is gained, because the same laws of nature are still functioning here, but they can be upgraded, so to speak, and come from a bigger place.
Hmm.
Yeah, one idea that's, you know, this looping back slightly, but one idea that's interesting in the tradition, particularly associating with the unity stage, but it also has relevance right through there. Is what's called Lesha Avidya, which basically means the remains of ignorance. Um, and the basic idea is that well, they talk about it like picking up some butter and then putting it down again, and you get a film of butter on your hands. And when you have, you know, infinite consciousness established and expanding into all the layers of being, it's still being lived through this body mind. I mean, you could call it a person, but it's not a person in the same way it was a person before awakening. But there's still a value of a human here. And indeed, I mean, the Brahman stage I touched on near the beginning, which sets the stage for pure divinity to be known, that essentially requires a human, an embodied human, to go through that process. And so there, essentially there has to be this small ignorance there. I mean, we as a human can experience a remarkable range of creation, but we're still a mechanism that experiences one thing at a time. It can be a very, very big thing, um, infinite, in fact, but it's still the one thing. And um, well, our mechanism isn't such that we can kind of do everything, all of it, simultaneously. That's kind of the purview of the divine. Um, but we can still bring out, like I talked about earlier, we have this unique combination of laws of nature to bring out some value of wholeness. And as we grow more and more into this, we can do that more and more effectively. But it comes through the filter of these laws of nature, these um, I wouldn't say limitations, but this framework. And it has its contextual frame, and there's certain limitations to it. You know, um, it's not what's dominant. What tends to be dominant is where our skill areas are, where our emphasis is, um, and whereas other people will have somewhat different. We've touched on this before, also, where um, you know, mentioning Dorothy Rowe, for example, has is a natural energy healer. She has those kinds of laws of nature, and that emphasis has led her to unfold certain layers of creation in more detail, because those are the ones she works on to help heal personally and collectively. Um, Whereas I have some overlap with that, but my emphasis is in a different region, so to speak, and I've brought out different kinds of things, and the laws of nature here are very different in certain ways, and so and then you again the same. You have your own flavor and laws of nature, and so one way of looking at that is as our um, faint remains of ignorance, our faint limitations that we have as being a human. But unless we have that context of being a human, um, we're not able to unfold in this way. I mean, in a post-human lifetime, evolution is still going on. There's still a soul unfolding, but the context and the platform is different. And so the stages we're talking about are very specific to an unfolding human uh, in this space and time. It um, I get a little bit cosmic there, but
No, that's great. That's a part of
but
the gift of human life, right?
yeah, exactly. But that's the potential. So it's like the human life is a limitation in a certain kind of way, but it gives us this platform, this profound platform that gives us the ability to reflect aspects of divinity in a way that I never expected. Was beyond my conception before, and I'm sure there's more yet to unfold.
Mm, yes. Yes, I'm also quite sure there's more yet to unfold here every day, you know.
Every time, several times there's been like, oh, this is the ultimate reality. Then it's like, well,
Yes, exactly. It's an ever um, deepening, complete yet in process unfoldment. And I just want to go back to to my mention of the direct path, because I don't feel like I really clarified there.
right,
It, in terms of something being direct, it doesn't mean that there isn't the room for application. It doesn't mean that there isn't still dynamic expression. Mm. You know, I think the basic misconception comes from where someone, the ego has the identification with the ego has become one of the seeker, or the sort of the aspirant, which is trying very hard to get somewhere and to do something or to see something or whatever the case may be. And so there ends up being this kind of burnt out seeker identity, this kind of fried, tired, um, someone who's been doing this for this many years or been looking here and there and still hasn't seen something or still hasn't realized something, whatever the case may be. And it's understandable that there would be a sense perhaps of lack or frustration or um, discouragement, or whatever the case may be. Uh, and then in that there would be an attraction to a very, what could be seen as a very sort of uncompromising uh, way of pointing or speaking, which
Yeah.
essentially negates or undoes that whole movement.
Yeah. There's also the tendency I've seen where people looking for results or wanting it faster or whatever, that they start to chase experiences.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so they start to look at the next big thing,
Yeah.
the special spiritual teacher coming through town,
Mm-hmm.
and going off and learning a new technique and a new and different mantra and a different practice and a different thing, or even someone has become fashionable to go after hallucinogens.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what's really important to understand is this isn't about experiences. A
Yes.
spiritual practice is about culturing the ground so that there can be shifts in being and recognitions of who you are to deeper and deeper levels. And chasing experiences is just chasing the mind, basically.
Yeah.
The mind is very oriented towards the senses looking out and to having experiences. And so when it's not seeing experiences, because a lot of spiritual stuff is very subtle, a lot of development goes on very quietly in the background. That's a good thing. Um, you don't really want a rough path. um, and so there's the tendency to start chasing experiences when the mind is leading the bus, and then people go off and teacher of the day and yeah, and some of that stuff can be hazardous. So it's
Yes.
and you don't make progress by meditating a little bit this way and then a little bit that way and a little bit that way, and
Right.
it's not a devoted long-term practice is far
Right.
more effective.
And you also don't make progress through saying that there's no progress to make, and intellectually understanding that and believing that. So there's, you and I both, we just kind of gave the whole spectrum. There's this side which tends towards the total negation or sort of rendering it ineffective or meaningless of any kind of possible anything in reference to spiritual application or or teaching, or anything. There's nothing to teach, Then on the other side, there are those that seek experiences and go from teacher to teacher to teacher, and new things and new mantras and new techniques and new wonderful shakti pots and things like that or whatever.
Yes.
So there's there's both categories in there, and I'm sure that some from this category slide over to this category from time to time, or some from this category,
Yeah.
whatever. It's all innocent and a part of the unfoldment. But there's another possibility, and that's that the motivation isn't being driven from lack. It's not coming from lack. you know there we can be given to something. We can be given to the spiritual path or the pathless path, or be given to truth without feeling that it is a transactional exchange. And that's where the frustration is rooted in. It's rooted from a lack based uh, transactional understanding of realization. And enlightenment is not the end of seeking. That's not enlightenment. That's not the definition of enlightenment. Seeking may not be there, but that's not what enlightenment is pointing to. Enlightenment is the realization of the reality of pure divinity.
Yes, and it's not a is not a goal in itself. It's a platform for living.
Yes.
It's a different perspective we can bring to life, which makes it a lot more beneficial.
It's also an expression of grace.
Yes.
So the grace of that same divinity that reveals itself as the one reality is realized to have been what has been unfolding itself the whole seeming way, whether there was the seeking or meditating or whatever. It's all been the unfoldment of this grace.
Yes, and it's a beautiful thing when you can see it in retrospect. You
Yeah.
recognize the hand of the grace
Yes.
coming in and at the appropriate time. But grace moves in the context of the whole.
Yes.
Grace isn't about what I want or what the right time for me in my schedule.
I agree.
It it happens when it's best for the whole, and when we do spiritual practices, we're preparing the ground so that when grace arrives, it's something we can sustain.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if we don't, if we negate practices and don't prepare the ground, then grace can show up as expected at some point, but the ground may not be ready to support it. So there can be some opening, and then we fall back in the mind again because the softening hadn't been done enough. However you
Yes.
want to frame that, and it's yeah, it's such an important thing, and so I mean, you get patience as you get further along the path because you can see the hand of the divine in this process,
Yes.
uh, in moving things forward, and there's a when you stop trying to be the doer, then when the doership falls away with awakening, then you start to see the much deeper flows of life through you and through those around you, and life itself, and you see there's this profound intelligence in the way the world is unfolding, the way the world operates,
Yes.
and it's not. Yeah, it's not. It's so much better than you could plan or figure out or do yourself as an individual. And so from that you get a lot more confidence and trust in the process. So yeah, prior to that it can be frustrating and yeah, it can be we don't see that yet. It can be challenging, but it just you just essentially have to choose a good path and be consistent and patient,
Yes.
and know that it's unfolding as it should. I mean, if I look, from my perspective, I look back at just how the world itself has unfolded since I was young. It's amazing, the changes. One of the examples I sometimes give, for example, one of my teachers before my time, he used to have people. They send them to the room to meditate and do these cycles of meditation and yoga asana and pranayama and stuff over and over again for like 12 hours. And this just to try and break through um, their own stuff, but also the collective, because it's much easier to support yourself in a bigger space when the collective is supporting that too. You're not uh, you're not being dragged down by it so much. And then by the time I came along, um, we were peaking at about I guess eight rounds, they call them, in a day, cycles of meditation in a day. And nowadays they do three,
Hmm.
maybe four, I would imagine, in some scenarios. But and there are people in a kind of more monk's lifestyle who perhaps do more. But the critical thing is to dip in and then come out and bleach the cloth, so to speak, in daily activity to integrate it. You need to. It's not just about escaping off into the transcendent, into consciousness. You want to bring that forward into your life, and so it's an integration of those two together, and that's the process of stepping into silence, and then out into activity, and then silence and out into activity, and kind of repeating that cycle. And that prepares the ground, that softens attachments. And it's, the point of practices here I'm talking about, a lot of the practices out there are about control of your experience in some way,
Mm-hmm.
control or focus, in meditation, or and you're walking around in your life, you're trying to be mindful all the time, and kind of create this mental division.
Yes.
Unless there's enough presence, mindfulness can be very useful as a practice, but it tends to, my experience here is it tends to arise spontaneously and naturally when it's
Yes.
appropriate. When you try to use it in your day-to-day life, if there isn't enough presence established, essentially it's the mind trying to manipulate its own experience, and that's just a control way. And so that's where I think some of where the people are rejecting practices, because they're just more the
Yes.
person trying to control their experience. But
Right.
there are forms of practice that are emphasize effortlessness and not non-control, and those tend to be more effective.
Yes.
Um,
So it's
although
not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That's kind of what tends to happen in that context, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 But you got to be careful too, because even there, people can buy into, you know, I practice the superior meditation, and
Oh,
I
right.
have all these and I'm I'm very evolved because I have long practice and all this.
Yes. Yes. That of course, and that's within the realm of what I would consider to be the spiritual ego, or the identification with being a spiritual person, and that can be also the identification with being no person, nobody, and you're stupid because you think you're somebody,
Yeah, but it's a
or whatever.
concept of being nobody.
Yeah, the
It's a
concept
mind
of
that's thinking it's nobody. It's somebody thinking they're nobody.
yeah,
Yeah. So
exactly,
that's
right.
this
And of
mental
course,
game, really.
it's much better to be nobody than it is to think that you're somebody or whatever. So
Yeah,
there's
it
all
is
these different variations, and
nobody.
then
Yeah,
there's the
yeah,
variation that you mentioned in the context of like adding the spiritual history or the spiritual story or the spiritual practices to some sort of identity construct. And those, so those things are what I would consider to be, you know maybe not obvious to the one that seems to be tasting them, but through grace, we talked about grace. Through grace, they become more recognizable when they are in place. And in terms of practice or application, it's the attitude, it's the willingness, the willingness to show up and to be shown. It's not when it comes from trying and attempting to control and figure out, then that's where there seems to be a difficulty. But anything that is approached with the humility and the willingness of uh, commitment and uh, devotion has the potential to be fruitful, I would say,
yes.
depending
And the
on.
mind naturally has that tendency, and
Yes,
that's fine. We shouldn't be hitting ourselves with a stick just
of
because we
course.
notice the mind's
Of
buying
course.
into it in some way
Yes.
and manipulating it in the experience. The mind just does that. But the key is we can culture enough presence, then we're going to recognize the mind's doing that and not take it quite so seriously. And over time we take it less and less seriously, and that just develops naturally. And then it's
Very
just
smart.
mind does that. It's like, oh yeah, yeah, that's just the mind running its stories. And we don't, it's just kind of like a narrative that's kind of like watching an old movie, and there's a narrator in the background. We can ignore it if we want to.
That's right. Just let it chatter in the
No,
silence.
no, David's going to make this decision, and this person I'm talking to is going to say that, and da da da.
Yeah, and that quiets down. It
Yeah,
quiets down progressively, because it's not being fed with the attention, and the drivers are being resolved. So the energetic condensation is being processed out. And a lot of that kind of thinking is arising from unresolved energy, actually. So we've covered quite a lot. There's one last thing that I want to say in as we've been discussing non-duality, is sometimes there's an understanding that in non-duality there can't be devotion, or that
oh yeah,
they're somehow contradictory, or they don't go together,
yeah. I
or there's
touched on Shankara's later teachings in that context. Yeah,
yeah,
that's part of
that's
it. Yes.
that's exactly right. So it kind of ties back into what you were saying about Shankar, is that there was a new level of richness and feminine fullness that came online after his earlier, some more intellectual, drier teachings or pointings, you might say. And for everyone that is in the midst of this unfoldment, devotion is very much a potential, and very much something that can flow without duality, without the sense of separation. There doesn't need to be any sense of separation in order for there to be devotion, in order for there to be love. So,
Beautiful.
yes, thank you. Thank you so much, David.
Oh, thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, it's really great. So, we always like to give all glory to pure divinity.
All glory, pure divinity.
Thank you, David.